Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Nicholas Griffin. Griffin is the author of 4 novels, including Dizzy City, The Masquerade, The House of Sight and Shadow, and The Requiem Shark. Griffin's latest book is a work of nonfiction. Ping-Pong Diplomacy, The Secret History Behind the Game That Changed the World, explores how a neglected sport incited a realignment of world superpowers. Griffin gave a talk titled Ping-Pong Diplomacy, Mao, Nixon, and the Art of Soft Power at the U of O on February 27, 2015, as a guest of the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. Thank you, Nick, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Remind us first what ping-pong diplomacy was.
Sure, of course. It's this extraordinary moment in the spring of 1971 when, after 22 years of frighteningly cold relations between China and the US, when everything seems to warm up at amazing speed, and it basically all happens through this 1 week where, out of the blue, a US table tennis team are invited into what was then known as Red China, and that seems to act as this catalyst for vastly improving relations. Suddenly you've got Kissinger on a secret trip, and within 8 months you've got Nixon himself showing up in Beijing.
So give us a little bit of background on where ping-pong diplomacy came from, because those of us who remember that, it seemed to just come from nowhere. But one of the things that's so fascinating about the book is that you find that there's a kind of prehistory there to this idea that you could use ping pong for diplomacy. Tell us about that part of the story.
It goes back.
It goes back.
It goes back a long way. I can go all the way back if you want me to. You want me to take you back into the world of England in the 1920s?
Yeah, because he's a player in the story, right?
Yeah. Well, it turns out that we thought of ping pong over here in the States as this sort of game that maybe you played in your spare room or maybe in a frat, but it turns out that it really was the only sport in the world that had communist beginnings. And that was because the rules were written by this extraordinary man called the Honorable Ivor Montagu, who was born, he was an Englishman, an aristocrat. He was born, his father and mother were Lord and Lady Swathling. And he grew up in this ridiculously large house, sort of rather like Downton Abbey. And he had sort of communistic leanings very early on. And in those days, if you were involved with the Comintern, which he was secretly, which was a communist international organization, the idea was to to infiltrate Western cultures with communist ideals. And they did this in many ways, and one of them was through sport. And so he came up with this idea that if he wrote the rules to table tennis, he could create a sport that was specifically designed at the working classes. And this is something he worked on, and this was an organization he controlled from its birth when he was 22 when he founded this. But he basically built a World Cup of ping pong and started bringing in all these countries from around the world. And he also used it as a way where he could travel to other countries and conduct, he spied for the Soviet Union from the age of 21 until pretty much until his death at the age of 80.
And he was on the trip.
He was on which trip?
I've seen a photograph of the team with Zhou Enlai, and he's in that photo, isn't he?
He's not in that photo.
Oh.
He's there. He spends a lot of time in China,
Uh-huh.
but he spends time in there in the 50s and the 60s, and then he eventually hands the organization over. So he's not actually there in 71.
So does he play a role in getting it to become this incredibly popular sport in China?
Yeah. Once he's in with the Soviets, as he is, and he's very popular with the Soviets, he even gets awarded their Lenin Peace Prize, which was the same year as Khrushchev. So you can't get better than that. But he's the one who tries to push the Soviets into table tennis. They don't really want anything to do with it. They don't understand it. But when Mao comes to power, he takes a flight over to China and makes the same pitch to Mao and Zhou Enlai. Wouldn't this make a great national sport for new China? And believe it or not, they agree to it, mostly because they already both are big ping pong players. He doesn't know that at the time. But during the bombing, when Chiang Kai-shek is busy bombing Yan'an and the communists before Mao comes to power, one of the ways the two men passed time together was they'd built a ping pong table. They were playing ping pong in the caves.
So in the West, it seems like this comes out of the blue, right? They're at this They're in Japan, they're playing at this tournament, and one of the Chinese players invites one of the American players onto the bus to talk. It wasn't a spontaneous event, was it?
No, no, this is something that had been used politically throughout the 1960s by the Chinese. Their team was now, by then they'd become the world championships and the world champions, and they were sent out to various countries with countries which China didn't have diplomatic relations with. And you know, the group of people who would travel with the ping pong squad weren't necessarily ping pong experts. They were politicians. The head guy in charge of the trip with the Americans was actually a People's Liberation Army strategic specialist. So he's in charge of the ping pong squad. Actually, the guy who started the whole ping pong movement in the 50s, who Mao gave it to, was a General He Long, and his job in the Civil War. He had over 150,000 troops at his command. His next job is dealing with the sports commission and the ping pong squad. So it was already a political tool. We just never thought of it that way. So when you get this special moment in 71, which seemingly comes out of the blue, it's something that's actually coordinated down to the last dotted I. And for instance, Zhou Enlai is the one who organizes the travel to Japan. He's the one who ensures that a team can even enter Japan, because China doesn't have diplomatic relationships with Japan either at that point. And this whole moment, which is so wonderful in a sporting sense, that this American ping pong player and this Chinese ping pong player get together and sort of plant this seed for world peace, just, there's nothing spontaneous about it. If anything, the American was a bit of a patsy in this situation, that he happened to, they knew where he was going to be. They called him onto the bus. They drove him around. They gave him gifts, and then they approached the team. Once they realized he was warm to them, they then approached the team and invited them. And within 48 hours, the team goes from being at a World Championships in Nagoya to being the first group of Americans to set foot in Beijing in 22 years.
Now tell us a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes in America that makes it the case that Nixon and Kissinger say, okay,
yeah, well,
what's going on there?
Nixon and Kissinger don't get a chance to say anything. They do approve of this.
Uh-huh.
What's happened is that there's been this attempt to create a sort of back channel between the two countries. They both have something in common at this precise point. Mm-hmm. End of 69 throughout 1970, and that is they both really like to mess with the Russians. They both have very distinct causes. For America, we're really looking for a way out of Vietnam War. We know that the Russians are loving what's happening in Vietnam. It's just this open, festering wound. It's on the front pages every day. And for the Chinese have got themselves in a real pickle. They've had the Cultural Revolution. They've removed themselves from the world stage. Mao now wants to recalibrate the Cold War. He doesn't want it to be just US versus Russia. He wants China to play a part too. So by doing this, he decides on a very risky strategy, which is to try and anger the Russians. And he does this by starting skirmishes on the border in the north. This goes a little wrong for him. Things escalate way too quickly, and within months you've got 1 million Russian troops on the Chinese border. Two communist countries that we would tended to think of as one monolith were actually on the edge of war. Russian low-level diplomats even approached some players in Washington to ask how we'd respond to a limited nuclear strike. So the Chinese had spent the whole time digging nuclear bomb shelters. So you're now at this point where we really have something in common, and that's how to talk to one another and turn Russia on their heels. The question is how. So they start these very slow-moving back channel through Pakistan. The problem is that it goes quiet after a while because of a miscommunication. So the reason ping-pong diplomacy happens is because the Chinese realize they have to do something that we can't mistake what the message is. And the idea is to get a press movement involved here and really to make this into a news story that can change the way the two peoples think of one another.
And it succeeds, does it not?
It succeeds to an extraordinary extent. If you look at the polls for what Americans thought of the inclusion of Red China in the UN before ping-pong diplomacy happens, there's never a majority. Within 2 weeks afterwards, you're suddenly in a majority. It's totally humanized the opposition. And what that does is it gives a remarkable amount of maneuvering room for Mao on his left wing and for Nixon in his right wing. Because, you know, I mean, Nixon says right after this happens, when it looks like relations could be normalized, he goes, no dove could have done this. He knows he could only have done this from on his own initiative, and he does that without even involving his own State Department.
So tell us about these two men on the bus, the Chinese player and the American player. Tell us about those two guys. Who were they, and what's interesting?
Well, they really couldn't have been two more different people. One was this counterculture kid, had been born in New York, now lived in California. He was a bit of a mess. He was a long-haired hippie. He wore purple bottoms. He took way too many drugs, and you know, he was a third-rank player, and that's being kind. He would normally never have associated with someone of the nature of the man he's about to meet, who's called Chuang Tse-tung, who's the world champion. He's the sort of Tiger Woods of table tennis. You know, he wins when he wants to. That they would even interact was very bizarre, but of course it wasn't bizarre because it was pre-planned. He was someone who had been heavily criticized during the Cultural Revolution. He knew what he had to risk because a lot of the other members of the ping pong team had actually died during the competition during the Cultural Revolution because of their associations. So here's someone who's really on a knife edge, but he's a very political man, and he goes a long way after this. Approaching Glenn Cowan will give him a lot of forward movement, politically speaking, and he ends up being among the more important members of the Chinese government. But at this point, he's still more or less just a ping pong player. So it's an extraordinary clash of characters about to happen within that bus.
So what happens with Cowan? Where does he wind up? What's the rest of his story?
Well, Cowan, you know, what the ping pong players don't realize during Ping-Pong Diplomacy is just how popular they're quickly becoming. You know, they go in to China, no one is paying attention. Within 24 hours, they're the hottest news story in the world. And that lasts all week long. It's just front page after front page after front page. By the time they come out, they're world celebrities. Now, Cowan thinks he can arrive back in California and ride this all the way to the bank, that there's going to be this huge rise in interest in table tennis, and he's going to be the face of it. Unfortunately, his fame lasts somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks. And that's something, you know, one's not quite sure how strong he was mentally before he went in the first place, but without a doubt, within a year of him coming back, he's diagnosed as bipolar. The drug taking definitely doesn't help. And then from then on, every time this time of year comes around, April when he went to China, he falls apart every year. If he's got a job, he loses it in April. And eventually he becomes homeless. He lives out of his car for a while, he loses his apartment, and he ends up dying very young, totally forgotten man.
Has ping-pong diplomacy had an afterlife? Does anybody still use it for these kinds of purposes? Any government still?
Well, the phrase gets used a lot. I mean, even when Dennis Rodman was in North Korea, you know, they were calling it basketball diplomacy, and you know, ping-pong diplomacy was brought up all the time. Like, if ping-pong can do that, surely basketball can do this. But of course, what's the truth about ping-pong diplomacy and why it worked is because it was the right time for it, and because the two political frameworks, the Chinese and the Americans, really wanted this to happen. They were looking for a way to get together, and they were looking for a way to change the way their peoples were thinking of one another. Now, the Chinese were the ones who decided on the medium, they decided on the timing, and they decided on the location. So it was much more of a Chinese ploy than it was an American. But it was something that was definitely mutually beneficial.
What led to your interest in this topic? How did you get the idea of writing this book?
Well, I've always been interested in the intersection between politics and sports. But I was in Beijing for the Olympics, and you know, obviously they were very political Olympics where China was making a real statement. And I thought while I was there, I'd go and see something which I thought of was really Chinese. Little did I know at the time. So I went to see the ping pong game, and if you're a journalist, they hand you these sort of vast packets of information. As I sat down, I had one of these, and the first line was, 300 million people play table tennis at least once a week in China. And if you think about that, if you know China's a top-down society, then you immediately ask yourself the question, who on earth gave that order? Because it's obviously an order. So, you know, it seemed like such a bizarre thing to do. So the only other thing I knew about ping pong in China was ping pong diplomacy. So I started digging back to see if there was a deeper connection between the two things.
So tell us a little bit about the research that you had to do.
The research took me to a lot of strange places. The most vital thing that I did was spend time in China, and I was lucky enough to find a researcher who helped me, who unlocked a lot of doors for me, and we ended up getting permission from the Chinese government to talk to a lot of people who'd been involved in the birth of their sports system in the 1950s and 60s. So we went and knocked on all their doors, and once we had that green light from the government, I'd say 98% of people sat down to talk with us. And we were basically talking to a lot of men and women in their 70s and 80s who had basically seen the entire rise of China. They'd seen Mao coming to power, they'd seen the Great Leap Forward, they'd seen the Cultural Revolution, they'd seen the famine, they'd seen it all. And we were able to put ping pong in this political context, which is very much where it belongs in China.
You say that the government gave the okay for you to do the research.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of the Chinese response to this book?
That's a more complicated answer. I was invited back to speak in China last year. I was, however, only invited to Beijing and Shanghai to the book festival, which is in English. So I think that was acceptable. I think the book seemed to be in a bit of a gray area where, in one way, I think it's very flattering because it shows what extraordinary politicians were involved and the level of detail in building this program is extraordinary. But at the same time, I don't think they're entirely comfortable with the book. There's been, we've been looking for Chinese translation, that we've got Japanese translation, but we don't have Chinese translation. And then when it came to film rights, we thought we'd had a deal with a Chinese company, but then they suddenly withdrew the offer. So we're now working with strictly American.
Why might they be uncomfortable?
According to them, it's all about depicting Mao on screen. I think, the real answer is more that you've got this ever-shifting gray line around culture in China, and you're never quite sure which side you're in. Now, I would say that a year ago we were probably just on the right side, and now we're just on the wrong side.
There is a part of the story, is there not, where one of the benefits for China of ping-pong diplomacy was that it distracted the world from the famine. Is that correct?
Yes.
Say a little bit about that part of the story.
Well, during the Great Leap Forward, there's this Great Leap Forward. It's not great and it doesn't go forward. It's an absolute disaster for China. And depending on who you believe, somewhere between 17 and 44 million people die between 1958 and 1961. So these are really dark days. It's just when this ping pong program is really coming to life, however, it's about the only thing that's really working in China. And Ivor Montague, our British spy, he's still in charge of sort of the World Championships then, and he offers them to China. And he does this as a way in which the Chinese can promote this very healthy image of a nation moving forward to help disguise the real truth of what's happening. And it's this extraordinary month in China where they managed to get foreign players, foreign coaches, foreign journalists, everybody in and out of China without anyone finding out that there are 40 million people dying, all around the country.
What was the most surprising thing you learned while you were researching it and writing it?
I never really stopped learning on this one, but I think the most fun I had when I opened up a sort of archival box was looking at the Soviet response to the success of ping-pong diplomacy. And within 24 hours, when the Soviets realized that this news story has caught fire and that it really heralds this sort of a reunification of the geopolitical order, that every Soviet ambassador immediately calls for a meeting with their American counterparts, and the message is the same all around the world. And you can read, these telegrams, traffic coming out of Africa everywhere. And it's all the same as, don't trust the Chinese, you should never trust the Chinese. We'll come back to the table really soon to talk about all our nuclear arms treaty, but whatever you do, don't cozy up to the Chinese. And those were highly entertaining too.
I wonder if they regretted not listening to Montague when he told them to take his course. in addition to writing this book, which has been very well received, it's gotten a lot of press, most of the other books that you've written are historical novels. They're not popular history or anything like that. What is it about the genre of historical fiction that attracts you?
Probably because it's a little easier to write than this. This book took me 4.5 years to write. You know, when you're going to put out a piece of history, you're dotting every I. Historical novels, there's obviously a lot of leeway and a lot of time to experiment and a lot of fun you can have. There are also certain stories that I think lend themselves to either fiction or non-fiction. In this case, had I written Ping-Pong Diplomacy as a piece of historical fiction, I know I would have been refused by every publisher in the world because it's such a preposterous story. No one, I mean, who could make up a character like Ivor Montagu, the table tennis playing British spy who makes spy movies? He produces all of Alfred Hitchcock's spy movies. I mean, you can't make that up.
But you could be writing novels that say were contemporary, that is to say, taking place in our moment. Why are these historical subjects of interest to you to write novels about?
I suppose it's history. I was a history and English literature major at college, and history has that added attraction of being relatively still compared to the present or the future. So it would just felt like a calmer playground, which suited the speed of my brain.
So you have a number of these novels. Which of the novels that you've written was the most challenging for you to write? Tell us about that.
I think that's normally, in my case, certainly my first one. I wrote a book called The Requiem Shark, which was based on this real-life court case. You know, the British keep every court case since for hundreds of years. So I dug out this court case from the 1720s of a pirate who had been tried and hanged, and it was really the story of his life. And there was a lot of information to be garnered that no one had looked at for 100 years, and it was a really great playground for me to run around in for a while.
So you mentioned in passing that there's been some interest in the film rights to Ping-Pong Diplomacy. Has there been any interest in your novels?
Yes, there has, and everything ends up in turnaround. I think that's the normal fate. One can't expect one's books to actually be made. It's just fun having them optioned and getting excited for a while. If it actually happens one day, that would be lovely. But I'm not holding my breath.
What are you working on now?
I moved to Miami, Florida about 1.5 years ago, and I'm fascinated by Miami history. And there's a great moment in Miami in sort of right around 1980-81 when it looks like the entire city is going to implode. And so I'd love to be writing about the sort of before and after, and how Miami sort of dug itself out of that hole and became sort of the thriving metropolis that it is today.
Will that be a novel, or will that be?
That will be non-fiction. Once again, that is way too strange a story to attempt to novelize.
You're from the UK. You just said that you just recently moved to Miami. You've been in the United States for quite a while. What brought you here?
I was born and bred in London. My father's English, but my mother's a New Yorker. So I always had New York family. So when I was 18, I got the chance to come over and start a whole new life here, and I never left. So
you're kind of a New Yorker, but you're telling me that you live in Miami. So help me understand that.
Wasn't my decision. I married a Venezuelan, and if you marry a Venezuelan, the natural magnet seems to be Miami rather than Caracas. Thanks to Mr. Chavez and Maduro, Miami is the place to go. So she had to move for business. It made a lot of sense for us as a family, and that's where we are for the moment.
And you've discovered here's the material for your next book.
I kind of knew that before I moved down there. I've been interested in it for quite a while now, but it's a fascinating city.
Can you say we've got just a couple of minutes left, the last question. Tell us a little bit about the experiences you've had. You mentioned that you went to give a reading of the book of the book in China. Tell us a little bit about that experience. What it was like when you read the Ping-Pong Diplomacy book. You mentioned that it was in English. Say a little bit more about that. Who was there? What was?
No, I mean it's a well-known festival on that side of the world. it's very much aimed at expats. So in a way, it's a wonderful way for the Chinese government to invite you as a writer, but of course, you're not really communicating with over 1 billion Chinese. You're communicating with 25,000 expats. So it's a good balance from their perspective. It doesn't hurt from your perspective, but of course it's not the same thing as actually being translated into Mandarin. But no, I mean, for me, I find Beijing's a fascinating city, and if I wish everyone could see it once, because it is about as disorientating a place as you could ever hope to come across. It's sort of a dozen Manhattans piled on top of one another. It's really quite intimidating, but the people, like Manhattanites, are full of beans and fascinating, and it's a wonderful city.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about the new book and about your other writing, and for coming to visit the University of Oregon.
Thanks for having me here.
Thanks everyone for watching. I've been speaking with Nick Griffin. He is the author of Ping-Pong Diplomacy, The Secret History Behind the Game That Changed the World. Griffin gave a talk titled Ping-Pong Diplomacy, Mao, Nixon, and the Art of Soft Power at the U of O on February 27, 2015, as a guest of the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. Thanks again for watching.